Hello everybody and welcome back to another Hearthstone video. So today I want to do something a little bit different. So recently I posted a guide on how to get to Legend for those people who are stuck in the ranks, in the very top ranks essentially, 5 to 1. And apparently people seem to like that. It was pretty popular, got a lot of hits, and what I mentioned in there is that one of the big factors, of course, is to eliminate a lot of the mechanical mistakes you make, and try to play as perfectly and as optimally as possible. And so I sort of left it there, because I figured that was a whole different topic on itself, and I wanted to really get into the psychological factors. But now is the time, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm going to talk today about what I think are the 5 biggest mistakes that people commonly make when it comes to Hearthstone. And especially in the top ranks, little minute mistakes that can really screw you up. So I'm going to talk about them in turn. I have some examples as well. I will be using a website that I've found that I'll talk about very, very briefly as well to sort of illustrate my points. The first point, though, I can't really illustrate because it's just something that that you can do generally and you don't need any particular board for. What I think is one of the absolutely biggest mistakes that people make in Hearthstone all the time, especially when you're almost at Legend, is you play too fast. Hearthstone is not a fast game, right? I mean, in one way it is for a card game. There's a time limit. You only have a certain amount of time to actually play, and moreover, a lot of the time the decisions you can make are quick enough and are simple enough that you can do it very quickly. However, if you notice in tournaments all the time, people tend to play very slowly. If you look at the top pros playing, especially control-heavy games, there are going to be a lot of players who actually have to play during the rope burning out, right? I believe it was Reynad who recently said that he loses to the rope fairly often. He was salty when he said that, but essentially what he was referencing is that he spends so much time thinking about his turn, essentially, and thinking about what possible ways the opponent could use what he played and what cards they might have and all of this sort of stuff, that once he finally decides on a play, he can't actually play it all before the timer runs out. And a lot of players do that. If you look at Trump play, for instance, he often analyzes until the rope starts burning. Trump and Reynad and all sorts of other players too. A lot of professionals take their time. And the reason for this is that Hearthstone is simple on the surface, but it's really very complicated when you get down to it. And a lot of players will spend a good deal of time thinking about how their opponent is thinking, what their opponent's deck is even, trying to really solidify that in their mind, what cards they are likely to have in their hand based on the plays they've recently made, and how this turn, for instance, is going to affect the next 3 turns, for instance, and how you can look at all that stuff. When you're just starting out, and when you're sort of in the lower ranks, that stuff isn't necessarily going to win or lose you games, but what will lose you games is making knee-jerk reactions. And when you see, for instance, the opponent has a 4 health minion on the board, and you have Swipe in your hand, and you have enough mana, if you do it right away, and don't even think about it, you're going to have a bad time ultimately, because maybe that was actually the right play, given your hand and given the time. But if you sat back and thought about it for a little while, you probably had alternate plays. You had different cards of different mana levels, and you probably could have done a couple of different things, and maybe one of them is more optimal, right? One of the biggest ways to make your play consistently better is by taking longer turns. It's that simple. Next time you're playing Hearthstone, even if you think it's stupid, even if you think it doesn't actually help anything and I'm an idiot, sit there and take 20 extra seconds. Just look at the board. Do nothing else. Look at the board for 20 seconds more than you normally would. And I guarantee you that in a reasonably quick time you will realize that doing that actually opens the world up a little bit. You will see plays you wouldn't have otherwise seen, and you'll actually consider things a little bit more. It's amazing how just a couple more seconds, and not feeling rushed, not feeling as though you have to complete your turn immediately, will actually help your play a good deal. Right? You don't have to complete your turn until that rope starts burning down, and if you're only contemplating 1 or 2 different plays, you can take as long as you want. Professional players all the time will sit there, and I do this as well, I will actually take my hands off the mouse, off the keyboard, and I will just look at the board, look at my hand, and think about it. I don't even want to, make gestures with cards. Sometimes I'll, be more impatient and play a bit quicker, but when I'm playing for real and I'm being serious about it, I try to take as slow a turn as possible, even when I know what the play is going to be, because I'm trying to think about all the different possibilities. So, Next time you play Hearthstone, try and take longer turns, and you will be surprised at how quickly that helps. So, that's one mistake. Here's another mistake. What we're going to talk about now is turn order. So, this website I have here is hsdeck.com. They have a couple of interesting things. They have a deck builder, as you can see up here, as well as you can look at all the cards. They have a neat little website, but one of the biggest things that's interesting about them is that they have a puzzle feature where you can build puzzles for people to play. And today, just for the purpose of examples, I've actually built a couple of different quote-unquote puzzles. They're pretty lame puzzles, really. But I built a couple of examples just to show you some concepts and to talk about different examples. So you might want to check these guys out if you're interested. Now, order of play is actually a really big deal. A lot of the time, you know what play you're going to make, right? You're going to play X, Y, and Z, and you will throw them out and all will be well. And a lot of the time, the order in which you do that won't actually matter. If you're going to play 2 minions, probably you can play either one first and it's okay, right? However, there's a lot of times where playing in the correct order actually makes a world of difference. And so this example here is a big one. So here we are as the protagonist hunter. We have 7 health, and last turn the priest on an open board, because the turn before they cleared our board, last turn on this open board this priest just dropped Ragnaros on the table. And as you can see from our hand here, we didn't have a whole lot to play last turn. So, I mean, that's why they had an open board. We weren't going to play a naked starving buzzard or anything. So, they threw down Rag, we went from 15 down to 7, and this turn, if we don't do something, we're going to die. They have 8 health. So, they're really close to death too, but they have a Rag on the table. So how do we deal with this? Well, as you can see, we have a means to do it, right? We Hunter's Mark it, we Arcane Shot it, it's done deal, right? So, a lot of the time, you see that, and you would look at it and say, you know what, that's perfect. That's a way to get rid of the big threat, so let's do that immediately, and then let's go with, let's see what else we have to do. So, boom, boom, 1 mana, we're down to 9, no problem, done. That's a really bad idea, because it turns out we have a means to draw cards. And so if you look at this, they're at 8 health, right? And we have 4 damage in hand. We have the hero power, and we have the arcane shot. That's 4 damage. That will leave them at 4. Now, because this example doesn't let us see what sort of cards we have left in the deck or anything, let's assume for a moment that we have, say, an animal companion, and say we have a kill command sitting in the deck still. Now, we don't know how many cards are left. Let's say, we're turn 10, there's probably like half the deck left or so. So, if we were to put down the Starving Buzzard and the Web Spinner, we have, say, a 1 in 15 chance of drawing either of those cards. So essentially a 2 in 15 chance of drawing an Animal Companion or a Kill command, if there's one of each left. Either of those cards could win us the game. If it's Kill command, we win immediately. If it's Animal Companion and we throw it down, we get Huffer and we win. If we don't get Huffer, so be it, but it's a 1 in 3. So there are ways in which, if we draw, we could immediately win. But if we do this first, if we Hunter's Mark, Arcane Shot, the Rag, and then draw, there is no way we can win this turn. Unless we were to draw Starving Buzzard, Web Spinner, and then like Animal Companion, and then another Animal Companion, and they were both Hover, or something like that. The percentage likelihood of drawing into a win is extremely small if we let go of the Arcane Shot. The thing is, this is only a 1 mana solution. And so putting down a Starving Buzzard and a Web Spinner, we can draw a lot of cards, right? If we get another beast, we can put that down too. We can do a lot of things before we use Hunter's Mark, Arcane Shot. And so, in other words, what I'm saying is, use draw mechanics first, in particular. In this specific example, and all examples really, you almost always want to draw cards first, especially when they can lead to win conditions, okay? Because then, the cards you're going to waste on removal, for instance, will go away needlessly because you could have used them to win, and you will essentially miss lethal. So it's important to pay attention to when you can draw cards first, and also just in general what order you play things in. You almost always want to pay attention to effects of cards. So for instance, this is sort of a basic thing, but if somebody has a Starving Hyena on the board, you don't want, or a Starving Hyena, a Scavenging Hyena rather, on the board, you don't want to kill other beasts before you kill it, for instance. It's that simple. If somebody has a Cult Master on the board, you don't want to kill anything except the Cult Master first, right? All very simple stuff. But especially when it comes to draw and when it comes to removal, you almost always want to draw first, especially towards the end of the game. It's much more likely that you'll get your solution that you are looking for in your deck because your deck is thinner, and you might waste removal if you use it first, when you could be using it, in this case in particular, to kill the enemy hero. Another example could be, having a fireball that could remove a threatening minion, but you use a draw mechanic and get another fireball, and you double fireball them in the face to win, for instance. There are a lot of instances where drawing first is the correct answer, and very, very often I see people drawing at the end of their turn instead. Almost always you want to do that first. Another really big mistake people tend to make a lot in Hearthstone, especially newer players, is that they are way too focused on the board. Okay? So let's look at this example here. So I am a druid against a paladin, and I have a really weird deck, it must be said, because I have a Stormpike Commando and a Spellbreaker in there, but let's just say, for argument's sake, I have this deck. This Control Paladin, I've established it's a Control Paladin, and so he doesn't have a lot of burst damage on him. He just put down a Loatheb this turn. Now, I don't have anything in my hand. Theoretically I would, but for the sake of this example, I actually just want us to look directly at the board. On this board, a lot of newer players are going to be tempted to trade, right? It's fairly easy here to go, okay, so Stormpike Commando here, Acidic Swamp Ooze here, they kill the Loatheb, I still have a 4-3 on the board, I hit him for 4, and I still have command of the board, right? I still have board advantage, and I can still play cards. So that's a good deal, right? The more experienced player will look at this a little bit differently. If you think about it, so here's Loatheb. Loatheb can do 5 damage, and if he hits me next turn, I'm down to 15. A Control Paladin at 6 mana cannot do 15 damage at burst. They absolutely cannot do that. There is literally no way that can happen. And in fact, they don't have 15 damage at burst at basically any point in the game. They're not a burst class, they're a control class. And so, we don't need to worry about the fact that he can do 5 damage because it's not going to kill us immediately. However, if we hit him in the face with all of this and completely ignore Loatheb, we're going to do 11 damage to him and put him down to 9. Now, even if we aren't a combo druid, even if we don't have Force of Nature Savage Roar in the deck, 9 damage when we have 11 on the board is massive, right? If he's at 9 health and we have 11 on the board, he can't attack with Loatheb, right? Because he has to trade with us. Now, theoretically, he could consecrate, right? He could equality consecrate, or he could just consecrate, whatever. He still is going to use Loatheb to clear the board. Think about if you were in this paladin's shoes, right? You have 9 health, and the enemy has a whole board in front of you. Are you going to waste time trying to hit him in the face? No, you will die if you do that. So instead, you're going to try very hard to control the board. In this instance, it would be really silly to trade, because he's going to have to trade for you, right? So in this particular instance, you want to get in as much face damage as possible, especially when you know that he is not a burst deck. He's going to heal. He's interested in healing. He's a control paladin. So the more damage you put on him and the more pressure you put on him, as early as possible, the better. And so in this particular instance, if you were to attack the Loatheb, you're going to put yourself in a much worse position. If you have 4 damage on the board and he's at 16 health, that's a much less threatening place than if you have 11 damage on the board and he only has 9 health, especially even if he has a 5-5 on the board, right? So one thing that new players are really, it's a scary thing, right? Newer players are afraid in a lot of ways of the enemy board, because if they have stuff on the board, they can do things to your board, and they can do things to your face, and all of that is very scary. But the more experienced you get, and the more time you spend sort of thinking about what decks are capable of, and what cards he may have, and what his 6 play is going to be, what his 6 card, or his 6 mana play is going to be, you realize that he really is not threatening right now, right? 20 health paladin with a 5-5 on the board at 6 mana, not going to be very useful, not going to be very threatening. You, on the other hand, in this position are very threatening, and it's something that you can use against him. So, I guess the real mistake here is knowing when to trade and when not to trade, and essentially knowing where the value is and where you stand as a player of the game, right? Are you the aggressor or are you the control player? And so in this particular case, you were very obviously, as Magic the Gathering players and card game players in general call it, you are very obviously the beatdown deck. You are the one who is on the aggression, and it's his job to control you, not the other way around. This is one of those things that I tell myself all the time. It's something that I have to struggle with, because I'm used to playing in a very controlling fashion. And I know that for new players, and for myself included, way back when I was starting, this was a big deal for me. This was a very difficult thing to get through my head. So once you sort of figure out that you don't have to control their board all the time, you don't need to make it so that their board has nothing on it before you start attacking them in the face. Once you recognize that, a lot more potential opens up, and you actually start to play a lot better, in my opinion. That's a big secret, I think, is knowing when it's okay to ignore their board. And certainly in a case like this, it absolutely is. So another big problem that a lot of new players have is exactly this one. So here we are, this is turn 1, and you have the coin. He passed his first turn. We're Druid against Druid here. And this is your hand. So what do we have? We have a useless card that's not going to do anything. We just drew that this turn. We have a Haunted Creeper, and then we have 2 Yetis and a Druid of the Claw. It's turn 1, and so we can absolutely coin out the Haunted Creeper. But we then have a bit of a problem, because then we don't have a turn 2 and we don't have a turn 3. A lot of players, though, will do that anyway, because that first drop is really, really important for tempo, right? One of the biggest mistakes I see people doing all the time is misusing the coin. In this case, I would say it is absolutely inappropriate to do that, in fact, because not having any plays on turn 2 and 3 is a really, really big deal. Even if you have a 1-2 on the board, that's not going to sustain your board all the way through till turn 4, right? In this particular case, it's actually a lot better, I think, to pass the first turn, play the Haunted Creeper on turn 2, as you would, and then coin out a Yeti on turn 3. Because if you do that, you actually have a perfect curve, right? You have 2, 3, 4, 5. And then by then, you'll have drawn into other things you can play and you're fine. The key with the coin is that you don't need to play it on turn 1. A lot of people talk about, with the coin you want to have a 2, 2, 3, 4 curve, right? You want to have a 2, 2 drops, so you can coin out one on the first turn, and then have the second one naturally, and you have a nice curve. And then you just play regularly. And so a lot of players, I think, when they see a 2-drop in their hand and they have the coin, they just go for it. This is not always the right way to go. And in fact, a lot of the time it isn't. If you have 2 Yetis, for instance, you definitely want to play one of them on turn 3. It's the same thing with if you have, for instance, a 1, 2, 3 drop, and you have the coin. You don't want to intervene with the 2, because that's going to make your second turn awkward. What are you going to do? Play the 1 drop and still have a mana remaining? You're better just to save the coin and play your natural curve. So this is sort of a short point, but you have to remember that when you're playing the coin, don't always play it immediately. If you don't have to use it right away, don't. The coin is useful throughout a lot of the game, particularly when you're playing control decks. It allows you to play a couple of things on a turn when you otherwise would have only had to play 1. It gives you more options in the mid-game, because it's amazing how, 7 mana is more versatile than 6, or 6 is more versatile than 5, for instance. But it's pretty rare, in my experience, that when you have only a 2-drop and not a whole lot else in your hand, that coining it out is the right answer. Almost always you want to use the coin for the purpose of smoothing your curve, as opposed to making your curve more awkward. The final point is one which I think is actually one of the hardest points to get through your mind. It's one that I know I had a hard time with when I was starting, and that is essentially winning the battle and losing the war. So here we have a situation where we are playing Control Warrior, and we're up against the bane of everyone's existence lately, the mid-range Hunter. And so the Hunter has a Savannah Highmane. We had, let's say a Cruel Taskmaster, and we ran it into it last turn. It's at 6-3, and he just played an Eaglehorn Bow, some other stuff. And we're at a life total that's a little bit scary, right? If we don't remove this Highmane, we're going to have some problems, right? Because essentially 6-3 takes us down to 14 life next turn, and then he's a Hunter, and so probably as kill commands he might have Leroy. It gets down to a pretty dangerous place, especially if he can attack with a Highmane more than once. So what do we have in our hand to deal with this? Well, we have Grom, and if we use Grom right now, it would take down the Highmane, and then we could actually cleave its two offspring. and the entire board would be clean, and we would have a 10-3 Grom on the table, which we could threaten him with. He might be tempted to clear it with his bow, and it would take him down to 8 health, and we're in a really good place, right? So that's nice, and he has to deal with that threat on the table somehow, so that's a good idea, right? Well, okay, so we'll think about that. We could also equip the Fiery War Axe and take this out ourselves, which is a little bit scary, but we could do it. We still had the cleave, and then we could play Cairn. So that's another option. I think a lot of players actually tend towards using the Grom here, especially if you're not as experienced, and particularly, really especially if you're not as experienced with a Control Warrior deck. So you play Grom here and you put out a huge threat, and essentially it threatens lethal very quickly. If he doesn't kill it very soon, the likelihood is he's going to lose pretty fast. But the problem with playing Grom here is that he's a win condition for you, and in fact, it's even more of a win condition because you have Cruel Taskmaster in your hand, right? Because for 10 mana, you can play a 12 damage charge with Cruel Taskmaster and Grom. And so, that's a win condition, right? He's at 18 health. If you only do 6 to him, you win. Because hunters don't really run a lot of taunts, and some of them don't run any taunts anymore. And 12 damage right directly to the face with basically no conditions, that's pretty good. So, if you use this to clear the high main, you're actually weakening your endgame fairly significantly. It'll feel really good, right? You get a 10-3 on the table, you cleave his offspring, and you are very clearly in command of the board, right? He has to deal with your threat or he dies. But it's actually weakening the play significantly, because let's think about what happens if you do the other way. You put down the Fiery War Axe, you hit this, you're down to 14 life. You cleave, the hyenas are gone, and you play Cairn. So this turn you have a Fiery War Axe and a Cairn on the board. Cairn is very, very difficult for the hunter to clear in basically every occasion, and you still have Grom and Cruel Taskmaster in your hand. What happens next is basically you win next turn, right? Unless he can deal 14 damage to you, in order to win he has to clear the Cairn. Why do I say that? So let's do the math. So he has to clear Cairn and Bane, because if you have 4 damage on the table, you hit him down to 14, your Fiery War Axe hits him down to 11, and then you use next turn all 10 mana, and you hit him for 12 in the face, which puts him at -1, which means he's dead. And so if you do that other play, you actually win next turn. If you put down Grom and clear the board that way and put the 10-3 down, he could Hunter's Mark it, he could kill it with an Unleash the Hounds, he could even take it on the face, that's fine. He's down to 8 health, and you have no means of killing him this turn. You have no means of killing him next turn. So, one of the big things to think about when you're playing your cards is essentially, how are you going to win this? Think really hard about how your deck is actually going to win the battle. If, for instance, you're a combo druid, you have Force of Nature, Savage Roar, there are going to be instances where it's very tempting for you to use your Force of Nature, Savage Roar combo for the purpose of clearing the board, right? Because, sometimes the board gets really thick and you don't have a whole lot of hard removal as a druid, and so it's tempting sometimes to use that turn, blow your combo, clean up the board, and then you get back to parity and you can start fresh, right? But the problem is, if you do that, in a lot of cases, you can't really win anymore. Because usually combo druids are built for the purpose of getting their opponent down to 14 life and then killing them in one turn. And so, if you can't kill them in one turn anymore once they're at 14 life, how do you win? Well, probably, you try and get some tempo and throw some stuff on the board, but your deck isn't built for that, right? And probably they will overwhelm you. It's the same with a Control Warrior. You have a lot of win conditions, and it's mostly by playing a lot of big legendaries, but you don't know what else you have left in the deck. Let's say you're close to the end. And Grom and a Cruel Taskmaster is a huge nuke, right? It's better than a Pyroblast. It's 12 damage to the face. And so, it's actually a very big deal if you have to get rid of that on some smaller thing, right? Especially because in this case, turning it into a 10-3 is not a 12-3, right? You'd have to Cruel Taskmaster it later anyway and turn it into a 12-2, which is a lot better than, or a lot worse rather than a 12-8, which it would be if you just played it right out of hand. So, it's one of those things where you have to pay a lot of attention to what the best means of clearing is and what the best means of winning is. Just because you can clear, just because you can win that particular battle, doesn't mean it's the right thing to do, because it might mean that you can't win the actual game itself. So, be very careful when you're playing the removal game, and especially when you're a control deck of this nature. Really pay attention to winning the battle and sacrificing winning the war as a result. So pay a lot of attention to what cards you're using to remove and how you can win. Always keep your win condition in mind and always have a plan in your head to win. Okay? So that's basically the top 5 mistakes in my opinion. It is playing too fast, it's playing in the wrong order, it's being too concerned with the board, it's misusing the coin, and it's winning the battle but losing the war because you sort of lost sight of your win conditions. So if you can keep those ones in mind, and I know, certainly for me, I identify with some more than others, and I know that a lot of people have problems with some, but they're okay with others as well. Try to pay attention to the ones that really get you. Try to pay attention to the ones that really sort of lose you the most games, and try to focus on that one. And essentially, once you start to keep track of it, and once you start to really look for it, it's surprising how often you can actually find it, stop it, and fix it, and actually do okay as a result. So really, if there's any big advice that I can give on that front, outside of sort of identifying those mistakes, it's pick one thing at a time and work on it. So if you are really bad about just making a play really fast, first play you see, consciously take more time on each of your turns, right? Get a stopwatch and turn it to 60 seconds, and put that on every single turn, and don't move until it's done, right? If you constantly play a lot of big cards and you find yourself using win conditions for the purpose of clearing a board, try really hard to think of what your win condition is at any given point in the game, and try to imagine how you're going to win, and whether or not you can still win if you use given cards to clear a board, for instance. If you find that playing in the wrong order is your problem, try really hard to think about what the correct order is to play things in at the beginning. So for instance, even just thinking, I have to draw cards before I do anything else. If you think that all the time, then when you get, a Novice Engineer or an Arcane Intellect or Flare or Tracking or whatever, you will be more inclined to use them first. And almost always, with the exception of Tracking and Flare, the Hunter's a little bit weird for that, but most other classes, if you decide you're going to play them, if you have the mana to play them, the correct answer is to play them first in the turn, almost always. So keep that stuff in mind, try to work on 1 or 2 things at once at most, and hopefully this video was really helpful in helping to refine your game. As per usual, feel free to ask as many questions as you like. You can post them on YouTube here, you can post them to my Twitter account at DreadmakerHS, and there's going to be an accompanying article here on Hearthstone players as well. Feel free to comment on that also. So, thanks very much for watching, and I will see you guys next time.